Hi, this is Dr. Gregory Sadler. I'm a professor of philosophy and the president and founder of an educational consulting company called Reason.io, where we put philosophy into practice. I've studied and taught philosophy for over 20 years, and I find that many people run into difficulties reading classic philosophical texts. Sometimes it's the way things are said or how the text is structured. But the concepts themselves are not always that complicated, and that's where I come in. To help students and lifelong learners, I've been producing longer lecture videos and posting them to YouTube. Many viewers say they find them useful. What you're currently watching is part of a new series of shorter videos, each of them focused on one core concept from an important philosophical text. I hope you find it useful as well. Michel de Montaigne, in his short essay on sadness, is going to begin and end by providing us his own, not just take, but also sort of a self-assessment of where he sits with sadness, but also with other extreme emotions. So we begin with him saying, I am among those who are most free from this emotion. How's that going to be the case? He'll tell us at the very end, but we're also going to see how it develops by what he reflects on. So he starts out with his rather negative assessment of it. He says, I neither like it, right? Aime, which is an old spelling of, aimer, to love, or to like, nor think well of it, l'estime. I don't really think that it's a good thing, even though he's going to contrast himself against the world by common consent. Now, when you hear that common consent, that is an old argument that gets made not just in philosophy, but in culture. And people still do this today. They just don't call it the argument by common consent. The idea is that, most people agree about something, so it must be right. So he says the world, by common consent, has decided to honor it with special favor. We look at people who are sad over certain things. We're like, oh, that's so romantic. That person is sensitive. That's good of them. And he says, wisdom is decked out in it. So sagesse, knowing things that you should know as a human being. So are virtue and conscience, conscience, right? And he says, this is a stupid and monstrous adornment. Wisdom, virtue, conscience don't actually need sadness. You're embellishing these things by adding sadness onto them. And then he goes after the Italians of his time. He says it's not actually sadness, but wickedness, being, malignant, quite literally, that the Italians have baptized Tristesse, for it's a quality which is ever harmful, ever mad. The Stoics forbid this emotion to their sages as being base and cowardly, and he thinks that the Stoics he doesn't agree with them on everything, but he thinks they at least are right about this. Then he's going to go into several stories, as Montaigne often does in his essays, and these are not just brought up to provide some ornament or color. They're there to illustrate some important points, but also to further the investigation, the inquiry, the conversation. So he talks about this king of Egypt in ancient times, Psammenitus, right? And his kingdom is conquered by a Persian king, Cambyses. And what happens to him? Well, the sort of typical things that happen in ancient times, which are not good, not only for the king, but also for his entire household. So we read that he sees his daughter walk across in front of him, dressed as a servant, sent to draw water. So his daughter has been reduced to slavery, right? All his friends were about him, weeping and lamenting. He remained quiet, his eyes fixed on the ground. Soon afterwards, it gets even worse, he sees his son led away to execution, but he's just looking at the ground, not crying, even though all of his friends are crying. So that seems like somebody who's got, a lot of self-control. But then what happens, when he saw one of his household friends brought in among the captives, he began to beat his head and show grief. Right? This is a sign of it. Sometimes people pull their hair out, they tear their clothing, they wail. It's all, kind of relative depending on what society you're in. But this seems kind of puzzling, right? So his children, he doesn't care about them. That's not bothering him. But he sees a household friend, somebody who's not as close to him. Maybe his friend is closer to him than his children are. Maybe he cares more about his friend. Then Montaigne brings up a more recent example. Charles de Guise, there are these wars of religion and all this political faction going on within France. And we find out that, he has some terrible things happen as well. He heard the news of the death of his very special elder brother, the support and pride of his whole family. Then came the death of his younger brother, their second hope. He bore these blows with exemplary fortitude, courage, a self-control, right? But then a few days later, one of his men happened to die. He let himself be carried away by this event. He abandoned his resolute calm and gave himself over to grief and to sorrow. So here's where we get into interpretations. So much so that perhaps it's something like oversaturation. You can deal with so much sadness being inflicted on you, and you can be courageous and resolute and deal with it. But then it's the proverbial straw that broke the camel's back. So in this case, Charles de Guise doesn't cry over his brothers, but he does cry over somebody that he's not as close with. Why? Because the grief over his brothers filled him up so much that just a little drop of more sadness overflows the entire vessel, or whatever other metaphors you want to use. That might also make sense out of the Egyptian king who doesn't weep over his daughter and his son, but does weep over afterwards seeing somebody from his household being brought out. There's another possible interpretation, though. So he says the truth is, the account goes on to tell us that Cambyses asked this Egyptian king, Psammenitus, why he remained unmoved by the fate of his son and daughter, but showed emotion at the death of his friend. Here's where we get to something really interesting. So the story goes, only the last of these misfortunes can be expressed by tears. The first two are beyond any means of expression. So losing your daughter, losing your son, you don't cry, not because you're unaffected, but because you are so affected you can't cry because the crying doesn't adequately express what you've lost. Charles de Guise, I almost said Duc de Guise, which would be his brother, right? Losing his brothers, same sort of story. Perhaps, we don't know. Both of them are possible, right? Oversaturation. You reach the point where you've endured too much tragedy, or whether it can possibly be expressed. And Montaigne is going to bring up two interesting examples from art, one of which is originally poetry, or yes, dramatic poetry, right? Because we only learn about the sacrifice of Iphigenia essentially through the plays. It's there in Homer. Agamemnon has to sacrifice his own daughter, which is ultimately going to lead to his own death, in order for the gods to allow the fleet, of which he's the commander, to travel to Troy to, go and fight against them for stealing Helen. And he doesn't want to kill his daughter, but he chooses to. This is a terrible thing for him. And what we see in the painting of it, he says, Portraying the grief shown on the faces of the people who were present when Iphigenia was sacrificed, the painter gave each of them the degree of sorrow appropriate to his feelings of involvement in the death of that fair and innocent young woman. By the time he came to portray the father, Agamemnon, of Iphigenia, he'd exhausted the resources of his art, so he painted him with his face veiled over, as though no countenance could display a grief so intense. We also have the instance of Niobe, whose 7 sons and 7 daughters are all dying, and she's overcome by such bereavements that she is finally turned into a rock. And what Montaigne says is, by this they express that sad, deaf, speechless stupor which seizes us when we're overwhelmed by tragedies beyond endurance. So stupor, being unable to do anything, right? And here is where he's going to draw a really interesting lesson. So the force, the effort in French, of extreme sadness, déplaisir, stuns, étonne, the soul itself, right? The human being is frozen, we could say. And he says that it impedes our freedom of action. It happens to us when we're suddenly struck with alarm by some really bad news. We're enraptured, seized, paralyzed in our movements in such a way that afterwards, when the soul lets herself go with tears and lamentations, she seems to have struggled loose, disentangled herself, and become free to range around as she wishes. That is, the soul has managed to overcome the, we could say, petrification of the body. Even worse can happen. It can lead to death. So he says that King Ferdinand was waging a war against the widow of King John of Hungary. There was a German officer called Reisach. As he saw men bringing back the body of a soldier slung across a horse, he joined in the general mourning for the man who'd shown exceptional bravery. Like the others, he was curious to know who this man was. When they took off the armor, he recognizes his own son. Amidst the public tears, he alone stood dry-eyed, sort of like these other examples, saying nothing, his gaze fixed on his son, until the violent strain of that sadness froze his vital spirits, depending on an older conception of the humors, with cold and hot and all that. And just as he was, he toppled to the ground. So sadness can sometimes lead to a person's soul freezing up and that person dying. Interestingly, sadness is not the only emotion that can do this. So here, Montaigne is going to shift to talking about erotic love, right? And he actually brings up a passage from Sappho, one of her poems. How pitiable I am. Love snatches my senses from me. As soon as I see you, Lesbia, I can say nothing to you. I am out of my mind. My tongue sticks in my mouth. Isn't that a great metaphor? A fiery flame courses through my limbs. My ears are ringing and darkness covers both of my eyes. This is the effect of erotic passion on the person who is attracted to the other person very strongly. And he says that we can't display our grief or our convictions during the living, searing heat of the attack. The soul is burdened by deep thought. The body is cast down, languishing for love, right? And here he even talks about occasional impotence. And he means sexual impotence, which comes so unseasonably upon men when making love, and the chill produced in the very lap of their delight by excessive ardor. And he says, if you want to actually enjoy your pleasures, they need to be somewhat moderate, right? So the ardor of love can have a similar effect on the soul that extreme sadness could have. But there's others as well. He talks about extreme joy. We can be equally stunned when surprised by joy unhoped for. And he talks about a Roman woman who was surprised by joy on seeing her son return from this rout at Cannae. So she thinks he's obviously dead and finds that he's not. And what happens to her? She falls down dead. Sophocles and Dionysus the tyrant died of happiness, right? And he talks even about Pope Leo X entered into such an excess of joy, told of the capture of Milan, that he took fever and died. And then he's going to bring up an even funnier example, and this has to do with a philosopher, and it's there to illustrate shame, having been shamed about something. The ancients recorded Diodorus the dialectician fell in the field, overcome by what? The extreme emotion of shame at being unable to refute arguments put to him in public in the presence of his followers. So he is humiliated, embarrassed in front of his own students and followers. He dies of shame itself. So it's not just sadness that can do this. Montaigne says, coming back to this, original point, he is free from that. Why? Well, because what he does is, he says, my sense of feeling, my apprehension, has a thick skin, which I toughen and thicken by what's translated here as arguments, in French, discours, right? So he actually adopts reasonings, thinking about things like what we just had in here, to help himself out so he doesn't have to feel these extreme emotions, whether they be sadness or, passionate love to that extent, or joys, or shame, or presumably other things like anger that might similarly derange the body and the soul. But it's primarily about sadness, and we get some really interesting reflections here about just what sadness can do to a person.